Welcome to Kiss and Chapters, where every story begins with a spark and ends with a swoon. If you love heart-fluttering romances, unexpected twists, and characters you'll root for, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so I can keep bringing you more sweet, emotional, and unforgettable stories. Let's fall in love with every chapter, together. Chapter 1. The Chill of a Life Wasted. The last thing Lin Yu felt was the cold. It seeped from the polished wooden floors of her chamber, from the elegant bamboo scrolls on the wall, from the flawless, untouched surface of the inkstone on her late husband's desk. It was a deep, permeating cold that had lived in her bones for 20 years, the constant companion to a marriage that had been a masterpiece of silent irrelevance. She lay on her divan, her breathing a shallow, misty plume in the chill morning air. In the adjacent study, the only sound was the relentless, precise scratch-scratch-scratch of her husband's pen. Scholar Shinwei was composing a memorial to the throne, a work of such purported brilliance that it would surely secure his promotion. He had not left that room for 2 days. He had not glanced in at his dying wife for 3. A faint, bitter smile touched Lin Yu's pale lips. Even her end would be an inconvenience, a disruption to his meticulous schedule. She closed her eyes and her mind did not flash with cherished memories or loved ones. Instead, it echoed with a vast, empty silence, punctuated only by the sound of that pen. It was the soundtrack of her regret. Regret for the poetry she had locked away in her heart, fearing his critique. Regret for the laughter she had stifled, deeming it unseemly. Regret for a life spent as a ghost in her own home, a well-dressed, perfectly mannered shadow whose only purpose was to be invisible. The scratching stopped. For one wild, fleeting moment, a hope so pathetic it angered her sparked in her chest. Would he come? Would he finally see her? Footsteps sounded, but they did not turn toward her chamber. They moved past her door, down the hallway, and faded away. He was going to the courtyard to clear his head, to ponder a complex turn of phrase. Her deathbed was less interesting than a grammatical puzzle. The last of Lin Yu's warmth fled. The cold rushed in. He welcomed it. It was at least an honest feeling. Her consciousness unraveled into nothingness. A sharp gasp tore from her throat and her eyes flew open. Instead of the dim, solemn light of her death chamber, sunlight streamed through latticed windows, dappling a familiar room. The air was warm, smelling of osmanthus blossoms and beeswax. Panicked, she pushed herself up on elbows that felt strong and young. She looked at her hands. Smooth, unlined, the skin supple. This was her old room. In her parents' house. Are you awake? The voice was bright, bustling. The door slid open and Madame Wang, her mother, entered. She looked years younger, her face unlined by the disappointment her daughter's marriages would eventually bring. Why are you lazing about? The morning is half gone. Come get dressed. I have wonderful news. Lin Yu could only stare, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was a dream. A cruel, vivid dream. Her mother bustled over to the wardrobe, not noticing her daughter's catatonic state. A proposal has come for you. A most excellent one, she chirped, pulling out a pale blue silk robe. From the Shin family. Their son Shinwei, you know of him? The brilliant scholar. Top of the provincial exams, they say he is destined for the Hanlin Academy. Such an honor. The name was a physical blow. Shinwei. The cold from her deathbed flooded back, freezing the blood in her veins. The scratching of the pen echoed in her skull. The image of his retreating back, his absolute indifference to her passing, seared behind her eyes. No. Not again. Please, not again. A violent tremor racked her body. She clutched the silk blankets, her knuckles white. The vibrant room seemed to tilt and swim. This wasn't a dream. The feeling of the sun on her skin, the scent of the perfume, the pounding of her own healthy heart, it was all terrifyingly, impossibly real. Mother, she whispered, her voice a hoarse croak so unlike the soft, controlled tone she had cultivated for a lifetime. Madame Wang finally turned, the blue robe in her hands. Her smile faltered as she saw Lin Yu's face pale as moonlight, eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. What is it? Are you unwell? She moved to feel her daughter's forehead, her touch warm and real. You look as if you've seen a ghost. Lin Yu flinched away from the touch. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the cheerful room felt like they were closing in, transforming into the silent, elegant prison of her future. She had seen a ghost. He was the ghost. Haunted by the memory of a life not yet lived, a life of profound and utter loneliness. She had been given a second chance. But it was a chance to walk directly back into the cold. A desperate, silent scream built in her throat. She had just escaped. He couldn't do it. She would rather throw herself into the river than endure another day of that crushing, respectful, soul-killing silence. Tears, hot and shameful, finally spilled over and streamed down her cheeks, tears she had never allowed herself to shed in her first life. Madame Wang stared, utterly bewildered. "My child, what is this? This is joyous news. Why do you cry?" But Lin Yu could not answer. She could only cry, mourning the life she had lost and terrified of the life that was being offered to her all over again. Her second chance felt like a crueler sentence than the first. Chapter 2. A Mirror of Regret. The tears would not stop. They were a silent, relentless flood, soaking into the collar of Lin Yu's sleeping robe. She felt unmoored, adrift in a sea of panic and memory. The cheerful sunlight in her room now felt accusatory, highlighting the terrifying reality of her situation. Madame Wang hovered, a flutter of confused concern. "Where? Speak to me. Is it a fever? Shall I send for the physician?" Her hand, cool and worried, pressed against Lin Yu's forehead again. "You're ice cold. This is not right. Such news should bring joy, not this affliction." The word joy was a dagger twist. Lin Yu squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image of Shen Wei's study, the perpetual twilight, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that never seemed to reach her. I cannot," she finally managed, the words a broken whisper. "Please, mother." "Not him." Madame Wang drew back, her confusion hardening into mild exasperation. "Cannot? What nonsense is this? The Shen family is respectable, his prospects are impeccable. This is a match any family in the city would leap at. What possible objection could you have?" She peered closer, a new thought occurring to her. Have you given your heart to another? Some lowly poet or painter?" The idea was so far from the bleak truth that a hysterical sob caught in Lin Yu's throat. She shook her head violently, the movement making her dizzy. How could she possibly explain? "I have already lived this life. I have already died in it. His Excellence is a polished stone that will sink me to the bottom of a cold lake. I feel unwell," she gasped, seizing on the excuse. It was not a lie. Her soul felt sick. "Please. May I have a moment?" The news, it was a shock. "I need to compose myself." Relief washed over Madame Wang's features. That she could understand. A maiden's delicate nerves. Of course. It is a lot to take in. Rest. I will have some calming tea sent in. We will speak later when you have settled." She patted Lin Yu's hand, her priorities shifting back to the management of the situation. "I must go and send our acceptance to the Shins before they think we are slighting them." Lin Yu's blood ran cold. "No. Mother, wait." But Madame Wang was already bustling out, the door sliding shut with a soft final click, leaving Lin Yu alone with her despair. Acceptance. The word was a death knell. He had to stop it. But how? She was a daughter, a commodity to be traded for social advantage. Her feelings were irrelevant curiosities at best, willful defects at worst. A commotion erupted in the hallway, a familiar, tempestuous sound of hurried footsteps and a voice pitched high with emotion. "Don't care. I need to see her now." The door to her chamber was thrown open without ceremony. There stood Lin Xing, her younger sister. Her usually vibrant face was as pale as fine paper, her eyes wide and red-rimmed from crying. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths, and her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. For a long moment, the two sisters just stared at each other across the sunlit room. The air crackled with a shared, unspoken terror. Lin Yu saw her own panic mirrored perfectly in her sister's gaze. It was the look of a trapped animal. Lin Xing slammed the door shut behind her and crossed the room in 3 swift strides, collapsing onto her knees beside Lin Yu's bed. Her composure shattered. "Jie," she choked out, the childhood endearment falling from her lips in a desperate sob. You have to help me. They want to marry me to the Jiang merchant. Father says it's settled. The name Jiang meant nothing to Lin Yu in her haze of fear. But her sister's anguish was a mirror of her own. She reached out a trembling hand and Lin Xing clutched it like a lifeline, her grip painfully tight. Mother just told Shenwei, Lin Yu whispered, the name tasting of ash. Lin Xing's head snapped up. Her tears halted momentarily, replaced by sheer, unadulterated horror. Shenwei. The scholar. Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. No. Oh no, Jie. You can't. You mustn't. The intensity in her sister's voice was beyond mere sisterly concern. It was the raw urgency of someone who had seen a cliff edge. Lin Yu's own fear deepened. Xing. What is it? What do you know? Lin Xing swallowed hard, her eyes searching Lin Yu's face. The truth hovered between them, a monstrous, impossible secret. She took a shuddering breath. I had a dream, she began, her voice trembling. A terrible long dream. You married him. You were so quiet. So sad. He never saw you. He only ever saw his books and his ambitions. You faded away in that quiet house, Jie. You died there. Alone. The world stopped. Lin Yu's breath caught in her throat. She stared at her sister, the words echoing the deepest truth of her soul. A dream? It was no dream. It was a memory. The dam within Lin Yu broke. The words tumbled out, low and frantic. It wasn't a dream, she confessed, her voice barely audible. I remember the silence. The cold. The sound of his pen. I died Xing. I felt the cold take me while he worked in the next room. Lin Xing's eyes widened further, not in disbelief, but in dawning, awful recognition. She breathed. I married Jiang Feng. He was never there. Always traveling, always making more money. The house was full of beautiful things and empty of everything else. I was so lonely I thought I would go mad. I died in a room full of gold and silk and no one came for days. They clung to each other's hands, two sisters shipwrecked on the shores of their own past lives. The impossibility of it was overshadowed by the sheer visceral reality of their shared regrets. We have to stop it, Lin Xing said, her voice hardening with a desperation that mirrored Lin Yu's own. We cannot live those lives again. I would rather throw myself from the city walls. But how? Lin Yu's mind, usually so orderly, was scrambling. Father will never refuse the Shen family. And your merchant, his wealth is too great an attraction. A wild, desperate light sparked in Lin Xing's eyes. He was always the bolder, the more impulsive. Where Lin Yu saw walls, Lin Xing looked for windows. What if, Lin Xing began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. What if we don't refuse them? Lin Yu stared, uncomprehending. What if, Lin Xing pressed, the idea forming with terrifying speed, we exchange them? The world tilted again. Lin Yu recoiled. Exchange? You mean you take Shenwei? And I take the merchant? The proposal was madness. Social suicide. An affront to both families. Think Jie. Lin Xing insisted, her grip tightening. You are calm and poetic. You would appreciate a scholar's life. And I am lively. I can manage a bustling household. I can talk to traders. Makes sense. It makes more sense than the matches they have chosen. Lin Yu looked at her sister, really looked at her. She saw the vivacious spirit that had been crushed by neglect in a golden cage. She saw the desperate hope for a different life. And she saw the terrifying only solution. It was a gamble of monumental proportions. But the alternative was a certainty of misery. The ghost of a future that would never be seemed to fade from the room. A fragile, terrifying hope took its place. Lin Yu took a deep, shaky breath. The tears had stopped. A strange, steely calm settled over her. She met her sister's desperate gaze and gave a single, slow nod. We exchanged them, she whispered, the words a vow. In the warm sunlight of her bedroom, the two sisters, bound by blood and a shared, tragic past, made a silent pact to defy fate. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Agreement. The pact, once spoken, hung in the air between them, shimmering with both terrifying possibility and the potential for ruin. The immediate, shared panic that had bonded them now sharpened into a needlepoint of strategy. They were no longer just two frightened girls. They were co-conspirators against destiny itself. Lin Xing, ever the pragmatist even in her distress, was the first to move. She released her death grip on Lin Yu's hand and stood, pacing a short, agitated path on the woven rug. We need to act quickly. Mother is already drafting the acceptance for the Shins. Father will be finalizing things with the Jiangs by day's end. The reality of their parents' efficiency was a cold splash of water. Lin Yu pushed herself up fully, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The weakness from her panic attack was receding, replaced by a nervous, thrumming energy. How do we even begin? We cannot simply march in and demand to trade suitors. They would think us possessed and lock us away. We don't demand, Lin Xing said, her eyes alight with a plan already forming. We suggest. We become the ideal choices for the other's proposal. We make them believe it was their idea all along. It was a subtle, clever approach. One that relied on manipulation, a skill neither had needed in their previous passive lives. The thought made Lin Yu's stomach clench. What do I say? Lin Xing stopped her pacing and knelt before her sister again, this time with the fervor of a general briefing a soldier. You Jijia are the obedient, thoughtful daughter. You must appeal to father's ambitions and mother's desire for stability. You must make the merchant sound respectable. Not just rich. She thought for a moment. When mother returns you must be calm. You must tell her your tears were not of refusal, but of overwhelming gratitude and worry. Worry. Lin Yu echoed, bewildered. Yes. Worry that you are not worthy of such a lofty scholarly family. That your quiet nature is better suited to managing a practical household. That the weight of being a scholar's wife, the social expectations daunts you. Lin Xing's words came in a rushed whisper. You must praise the Jiang family's stability. Their generosity. Hint that such a connection could be a solid, reliable asset for father's position at court, less prone to the fickle winds of political favor than a scholar's reputation. It was brilliant. It was a language their parents would understand perfectly. Lin Yu nodded slowly, absorbing the script. She could do this. It was merely another performance, and she had spent a lifetime performing the role of the perfect daughter. This was just a different part in a much more crucial play. And you? Lin Yu asked. What will you do? A defiant spark lit in Lin Xing's eyes. I will have a tantrum. Before Lin Yu could respond, the sound of footsteps approached. Lin Xing shot her a last meaningful look and melted back from the bedside just as the door slid open. Madame Wang entered, followed by a maid carrying a tray of steaming tea and bland congee. Yue, I've brought you Xinger? What are you doing here? Her brow furrowed, noticing her younger daughter's presence and her still flushed cheeks. Lin Xing didn't give her a chance to probe. She burst into tears, loud, dramatic, and utterly convincing. Mother! It's unfair. Why does Jejie get the brilliant scholar and I am to be sold off to some coarse merchant who counts his coins all day? I shall be the laughingstock of the city. Madame Wang's face tightened with irritation. Lin Xing. Control yourself. The Jiang family is exceedingly wealthy. You will want for nothing. I want for respect. Lin Xing wailed, flinging herself into a chair. I want a husband of culture and learning, not some tradesman. If Jejie does not want the scholar, I shall take him. At least he has a mind. The audacity of the statement left Madame Wang momentarily speechless. Lin Yu seized her chance. Mother, she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through Lin Xing's performance. She sat up straighter, composing her features into an expression of gentle contrition. Please do not be angry with Xing. My tears, forgive me. They were not of displeasure. The Xin family's offer is an incredible honor. Madame Wang turned to her, momentarily distracted from the shrieking Lin Xing. Then what, pray tell, was the meaning of such a display? Lin Yu looked down at her hands, folding them neatly in her lap. It is only. I feel inadequate. Scholar Xin is destined for great things. His wife will need to be a pillar of intellectual and social grace. I fear my quiet nature is a poor match. The pressure, it overwhelmed me. She glanced up, her eyes wide and sincere. Perhaps a less scrutinized position would be better? I have heard the Jiang merchant is a man of business, not courtly politics. His household would be simpler. A practical match. His wealth could be a great support to father's work, could it not? A steady foundation rather than the unpredictable rise of a scholar. She held her breath. She had woven in every thread Lin Xing had given her. Madame Wang stared at her, her irritation giving way to thoughtful silence. She looked from Lin Yu's pale, pleading face to Lin Xing's theatrically miserable one. The gears of her mind, always calculating social and political advantage, began to turn. A quiet daughter in a bustling merchant's house? A vivacious daughter in a stern scholar's compound? It was unorthodox. But Lin Yu's points were not without merit. A scholar's success was never guaranteed, while a merchant's wealth was tangible and immediately useful. Later that evening they overheard their parents talking in low voices in the main hall. The girl has a point in her way, Lin Xuan's voice rumbled. Xin Wei's prospects are bright, but they are just that, prospects. Jiang Feng's capital is real. Having such a son-in-law could be advantageous. Less prestigious, perhaps, but more practical. And Xing'e, Madame Wang mused, her voice laced with a dawning possibility. Can you imagine her managing a merchant's household? She talked the birds out of the trees. She'd be bored to tears. But a scholar's wife, that is a position of dignity. It might finally force some refinement upon her. And she is clever enough in her way to be an asset to him. Lin Yu and Lin Xing, listening from the shadowed corridor, shared a look of stunned, disbelieving hope. Their parents were talking themselves into it. The next morning Madame Wang summoned them both. Her expression was a mixture of resignation and newfound conviction. Your father and I have discussed it, she announced, as if the idea had been hers all along. Given your temperaments, perhaps an adjustment is prudent. Lin Yu, your serene nature may indeed be better suited to the management of a prosperous household. Lin Xing, your energy might be just what a serious scholar needs to bring him into society. She sighed, a long-suffering sound. We will propose the exchange to the families. It is highly irregular, but given the circumstances they may see the wisdom in it. When she left, the sisters were alone. The silence in the room was no longer filled with dread, but with a fragile, breathless anticipation. They had done the impossible. They had bent fate. Lin Xing grabbed Lin Yu's hands, her earlier dramatics gone, replaced by genuine, trembling hope. It's working, Jie. Lin Yu nodded, her heart still pounding. The first obstacle was cleared. But now a new fear took root. They had won the chance to change their futures. But what if their new choices were just different kinds of prisons? She had just agreed to tie her life to a man she knew nothing about, a merchant whose world was a complete mystery. The unknown, she realized with a fresh wave of anxiety, could be just as terrifying as the known. Chapter 4. The Weight of a New Token. The days that followed were a blur of tense silence and hushed negotiations. The Lin household held its breath, waiting for the response from the Xin and Jiang families. Lin Yu moved through her routines like a ghost, her heart leaping into her throat every time a messenger arrived at the gate. The fear was a constant, cold companion. Had they overreached? Would both families be so insulted by the audacious proposal that they would withdraw entirely, leaving the sisters disgraced and unmarriageable? Or worse, would one agree and the other refuse, trapping one of them in the very fate they sought to escape? Finally the answers came, delivered on fine paper with formal seals. Madame Wang summoned the sisters to the main receiving hall, her expression unreadable. On a low lacquered table lay 2 boxes. The Xin family, she began, her voice clipped, has agreed, though not without reservation. They believe a more lively wife might indeed benefit their son's career by forging stronger social connections. She gestured to one box, long and slender, made of dark, polished zeton wood. It was austere, elegant, and utterly familiar to Lin Yu. It filled her with a deep, visceral dread. The Jiang family, Madame Wang continued, a slight, perplexed frown on her face, has also agreed. Master Jiang expressed curiosity. Her eyes flickered to Lin Yu, and for a moment, Lin Yu saw a flicker of her mother's own confusion about this entire affair. She gestured to the second box. This one was broader, carved from rich, warm mahogany inlaid with mother-of-pearl, depicting a scene of a merchant ship on a river. It was lavish, foreign, and completely unknown. The betrothal is settled, Madame Wang said. Lin Xing is promised to Xin Wei. Lin Yu is promised to Jiang Feng. She looked at them both. Do not make us regret this. With that she swept out, leaving the sisters alone with their new destinies. For a long moment neither moved. They simply stared at the boxes, the physical representations of their gamble. Lin Xing was the first to step forward, her hand hovering over the Zetonwood box. With a sharp intake of breath, she opened it. Nestled on a bed of dark silk lay a single hairpin. It was exquisitely crafted from white jade, carved into the form of a solitary upright bamboo stem, a symbol of scholarly resilience and integrity. It was beautiful, cold, and impersonal. Lin Xing picked it up. It looked fragile and severe in her hand. A symbol of the rigid world she was now bound to. She didn't flinch. A determined set settled on her jaw. "It's just a pin," she whispered, though whether to herself or to Lin Yu it wasn't clear. Then she turned to the second box. "Open it, Jie." Lin Yu's feet felt rooted to the floor. The mahogany box seemed to pulse with unseen energy. Taking a hesitant step forward, she reached out and lifted the lid. The interior was lined with crimson silk. Resting upon it was not a single item but a pair. A bracelet, but unlike any she had ever seen. It was made of heavy, impeccably worked gold, not into delicate filigree, but into interlocking bands that felt substantial and secure. It was warm to the touch as if infused with the sun. And beside it lay not a scholar's inkstone, but a smaller, matching hairpin. This one was also gold, fashioned into a blooming peony, its petals detailed with startling realism, each one tipped with a tiny, perfect pearl. It was generous. It was lavish. It was utterly without the subtle, coded meaning of the scholar's gift. This was a gift of pure, unapologetic prosperity and beauty. Tentatively, Lin Yu picked up the bracelet. It was solid in her palm, far heavier than it looked. The weight of it was anchoring, not oppressive. This was not the cold, symbolic jade of a life of quiet duty. This was the warm, tangible gold of what? He didn't know. Lin Xing peered over her shoulder. "It's bold," she said, her voice a mix of awe and apprehension. Lin Yu could only nod, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool gold. She thought of the hairpin Shen Wei had given her in her first life. A similar cold jade, a similar feeling of being catalogued and placed on a shelf. This gift felt different. It felt like it was meant to be worn, to be seen. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. It settled there with a comfortable, significant weight. It did not feel like a chain. It felt like an anchor. A promise of something solid. But the fear remained, coiling in her stomach. The scholar's world had been a known quantity. A silent, cold misery she understood intimately. This merchant's world was a vast, echoing question mark. What was the man behind this generous gift truly like? Was he a boorish man obsessed only with profit, who would see a wife as another acquisition? Was his home a garish display of wealth with no soul? Would she be just another beautiful object in his collection, like this bracelet, to be displayed and ignored? The warmth of the gold on her wrist seemed to mock her. This gamble had been an act of desperate escape. But as she looked at the rich, unknown token of her new betrothal, a new, terrifying realization dawned. She had fled a prison of ice only to potentially throw herself into a gilded cage. The silence of the scholar's compound had been deafening. What if the noise of the merchant's house was just as lonely? She closed the lid of the mahogany box, the soft click echoing in the silent room. The weight of the bracelet on her wrist was a constant reminder. She had chosen the unknown. And now she had to live with the terrifying, exhilarating weight of it. Chapter 5. A first glimpse of warmth. The formal request arrived 2 days later, inscribed on a card of thick, expensive paper that smelled faintly of sandalwood and travel. Master Jiang Feng humbly requested the honor of a meeting with his betrothed Lin Yu in the presence of her family, to take tea in the Lin family's central garden. The panic that had receded into a low hum now surged back, a roaring tide in Lin Yu's ears. The theoretical, distant merchant was now a reality. She would have to sit across from him, make conversation, and somehow pretend she wasn't silently comparing him to the ghost of the husband she'd once had. The morning of the meeting was an agony of preparation. Madame Wang fussed over her, selecting a robe of subdued lavender silk elegant enough to show respect for the Jiang family's status, but modest enough to suit her purported serene nature. "Remember," her mother instructed, adjusting the gold peony pin in Lin Yu's hair, a deliberate choice to show she valued the betrothal gift. "Speak little, listen much. Be demure. Let him see the composure we praised." Composure. Lin Yu felt anything but composed. Her hands were ice, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt like a fragile piece of porcelain being presented for inspection, terrified of the slightest crack being discovered. She was led to the shaded pavilion in the garden. Her father was already there, looking uncharacteristically attentive. And then he arrived. Jiang Feng was not what she had expected. She had braced for a large, loud man, perhaps florid-faced from good living, draped in overly ornate robes. The man who bowed to her parents was tall and lean, his movements economical and precise. His robes were of the finest dark blue silk, but the cut was simple, almost severe, adorned only with subtle embroidery at the cuffs. His face was not soft but sharp-planed and thoughtful, his eyes the most striking thing about him, dark, intelligent and intensely observant. They took in the entire pavilion, her parents and finally her, in one swift, comprehensive glance. Lin Yu's carefully rehearsed curtsy felt clumsy under that gaze. The pleasantries were exchanged. Jiang Feng's voice was another surprise, a low, calm baritone, not the booming pronouncement she'd feared. He spoke to her parents with a respectful confidence that was neither obsequious nor arrogant. He listened more than he talked. Then his attention turned to her. Lin Yu felt her spine stiffen, her eyes dropping to the teacup in her lap. She was waiting for the inevitable awkward questions about her hobbies or her embroidery, the kind of empty conversation Shen Wei had used to fill their rare, stilted interactions. The Lin family gardens are renowned for their harmony, Jiang Feng said, his tone conversational. I noticed the careful placement of the weeping willow by the koi pond. It provides shade for the fish and a pleasing contrast to the upright bamboo. A thoughtful design. It was not a question for her. It was an observation. And it was about aesthetics, not commerce. Surprised, Lin Yu's eyes flickered up to meet his. He wasn't looking at her expectantly. He was gazing out at the garden, appreciating the view. He had given her an opening without demanding she walk through it. It was designed to be viewed from the west in the afternoon, she heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper. The light it filters through the willow leaves and dapples the pond. Jiang Feng turned his head and looked directly at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. A slight, considering smile touched his lips. A painter's eye, he remarked. I have seen similar techniques used in the imperial gardens. It is a subtle art. He had not only listened, he had understood the intent. Shen Wei would have simply nodded and returned to his thoughts. A strange, faint warmth began to seep through the cold dread in her veins. The conversation continued, flowing around her like a gentle stream. Jiang Feng spoke briefly of his recent travels to the south, not to boast of deals made, but to describe the stunning terraced rice fields that looked like steps to heaven. He mentioned the unique quality of light there and how it differed from the light in their own province. He was, she realized with a start, a man who noticed things. Not just ledgers and goods but light and landscapes. At one point he reached for his teacup. Lin Yu noticed his hands. They were not the soft, pale hands of a scholar, meticulously kept for holding a brush. These were capable hands, with long, strong fingers and a faint callus on the forefinger, perhaps from holding a writing brush for long hours, but also a weathered strength that spoke of a man who might not be afraid to check the rigging on one of his ships or examine a bolt of silk himself. They were hands that did things. The meeting was drawing to a close. Jiang Feng rose and bowed to her parents. Then he turned to Lin Yu and performed a deeper, formal bow to her. Miss Lin, he said, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment that felt suspended in time. I look forward to our next meeting. There was no flowery poetry, no empty flattery. It was a simple, direct statement. And yet, it felt more respectful than any sonnet Shen Wei had ever half recited to her. He took his leave. The pavilion felt suddenly empty, the air still buzzing with his quiet presence. Madame Wang was visibly pleased. Well, he is certainly not what one expects of a merchant. So refined. And so clearly taken with you are. Lin Yu barely heard her. She was staring at the space where he had been sitting, her mind replaying the encounter. He hadn't tried to impress her with his wealth or his wit. He hadn't dismissed her quietness as a flaw. He had simply noticed things, including her one small contribution. The cold knot of fear in her stomach was still there, but it had loosened just a little. Around it, that faint warmth persisted. He was not Shen Wei. That much was blindingly clear. He was an enigma, a merchant with the eyes of an artist and the hands of a man who knew his own world intimately. For the first time since awakening in her past life, the future did not feel like a predetermined path of misery. It felt uncertain. And uncertainty, she was beginning to understand, was far preferable to the bleak certainty of her first life. It was a fragile feeling, but it was hope. Chapter 6. The Uneasy Threshold. The day of the wedding arrived in a blur of crimson silk and the heady scent of incense. Lin Yu was dressed in heavy, embroidered robes, her face painted into the placid mask of a blissful bride. The gold bracelet felt like a brand on her wrist, a constant, heavy reminder of the unknown she was walking toward. The ceremonies passed in a haze of ritual and numbness. She performed the vows, accepted the blessings, and allowed herself to be led from her parents' home, the only home she had ever known, into a covered sedan chair that would carry her to the Jiang compound. As the chair was lifted, the reality of her choice crashed down upon her. She was leaving. Truly leaving. The familiar sounds of her childhood home, her mother's fussing, the distant chatter of the servants, the particular way the gate creaked faded away, replaced by the rhythmic tread of the bearers and the alien noise of the city. She was alone. Utterly alone. The journey felt both endless and terrifyingly short. When the chair was set down, the door opened to not the austere silence of the Shen compound, but to a wave of sound. Music, lively and celebratory, filled the air. The scent of rich food and wine wafted from the open doors. There was laughter, the bustling of what sounded like a small army of servants, and the general cacophony of a great many people enjoying themselves. It was overwhelming. Lin Yu's heart hammered against her ribs. She had prepared herself for coldness, for silence. She had not prepared for this vibrant chaos. She wanted to shrink back into the sedan chair, to hide from the sheer energy of it all. A hand appeared at the door, not the soft hand of a steward, but a capable, familiar one. Jiang Feng. She placed her trembling fingers in his and he helped her alight. Through the heavy phoenix crown she could see his face. He looked solemn, but his eyes held a warmth that steadied her, just for a moment. "Welcome," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the din. He did not let go of her hand as he led her through the throng of well-wishers and into the main hall for the final rituals. His grip was firm, grounding. It was a small anchor in the roaring sea of strangers and noise. The wedding banquet was a lavish, boisterous affair. Lin Yu sat beside him, a silent statue, picking at the exquisite food that tasted like ash in her mouth. She watched him. He was a gracious host, moving through his duties with an easy confidence. He exchanged jokes with business associates, accepted toasts with a smile, and deftly navigated the complex social web of the event. He was in his element, and she felt more out of place than ever. When the last guest finally departed and the servants began the mammoth task of cleaning, the compound settled not into silence, but into a different kind of noise, the satisfied hum of an event well executed. Jiang Feng led her to their bridal chamber. It was a large, beautifully appointed room. It was not the sparsely furnished, book-lined study of her first wedding night. This room was warm, with rich hangings on the walls and plush carpets underfoot. A fire crackled in the hearth, chasing away the evening chill. The door closed and they were alone. The silence between them was thick and heavy. Lin Yu stood frozen in the center of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could feel his gaze on her. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment of expectation. She waited for him to approach. To claim his husbandly rights. To reduce this fragile, terrifying new beginning to a single transactional act. But he didn't. Instead, he moved to a side table where a pot of tea sat keeping warm over a small brazier. "It has been a long day," he said, his back to her. His voice was calm, devoid of any pressure. "You must be exhausted." He poured 2 cups of tea and turned, offering one to her. She took it numbly, the heat of the porcelain seeping into her cold fingers. "This is your home now," he said, not moving closer. "I know it must feel overwhelming. It is very different from the Lin estate." She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. Overwhelming was too small a word. He took a sip of his tea, his eyes scanning the room before returning to her. "I have business in the morning that cannot be postponed. A shipment coming in from the south. It will require my early attention." Lin Yu's head shot up. Business? On his wedding night? A strange, conflicting rush of emotions flooded her, profound relief immediately followed by a sharp sting of, was it insult? Was she so insignificant that he would choose ledgers over his new wife? Was this to be her first taste of the neglect Lin Xing had described? He must have seen the turmoil on her face. He set his cup down. "It is not a slight, Lin Yu," he said, and the use of her name so direct and personal made her flinch. "It is a reality of my world. But," he paused, choosing his words with care, "this marriage is not a transaction to me. I have no desire to begin it with haste." He walked to a beautifully carved cabinet and opened it. Inside were not books but shelves of scrolls and ledgers. From a high shelf he pulled out an object wrapped in a piece of dark silk. He brought it over and placed it in her hands. It was a book, but unlike any she had seen in the Shen household. Its binding was of soft tooled leather, and the pages were of a thick creamy paper. When she opened it, the script was not the standard characters of their language, but a flowing, artistic script she didn't recognize. Interspersed were beautiful hand-painted illustrations of landscapes, rolling hills under strange stars, deserts of red sand, oceans with terrifyingly large waves. "It is a book of poetry," Jiang Feng said, his voice quiet. "From the far western regions. The poems are said to be written by travelers. They speak of longing for home and of the beauty of the road. I thought you might appreciate it." Lin Yu stared at the book in her hands. She traced a painting of a lonely camel against a vast dunes. She could not read the words, but she could feel the sentiment. It was a gift of staggering thoughtfulness. It acknowledged her love of poetry while acknowledging the journey she was on. It was a bridge between his world and hers. He wasn't leaving her out of neglect. He was giving her space. He was offering her a key, not demanding entry. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes. She looked from the book to him, this man who was her husband, and saw not a merchant, but a person of unexpected depth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He gave a brief, almost shy nod. "Rest. The servants will see to your needs in the morning. This is your home. Make yourself at ease in it." With that he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Lin Yu stood alone in the warm, quiet room, the foreign book held to her chest. The silence that enveloped her was not the cold, empty silence of the Shun compound. It was a silence filled with potential. It was a space he had given her. To breathe. To grieve. To simply be. He was not ignored. He was seen. And in that seeing she had been granted a kindness so profound it shattered the last of her defenses. The tears fell freely now, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of release, of a hope so fragile she hardly dared to name it. She had crossed the threshold into the unknown, and instead of a jailer she had found a man who offered her a book and a door left slightly ajar. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Chapter 7. A vulnerability shared. The rhythm of life in the Jiang compound settled around Lin Yu like a new, unfamiliar garment. Initially strange but not uncomfortable. The silence Jiang Feng had gifted her on that first night became a space she learned to inhabit. She spent her days exploring the vast house, her footsteps echoing in sunlit courtyards. She arranged her new library, placing the book of Western poetry in a position of honor. She began a new poem, the first in over a decade, its words hesitant but genuine. Jiang Feng was true to his word. He was often gone before she rose, and his returns were late, often after she had already retired. Their paths crossed infrequently, usually at the evening meal, which was a quiet, almost formal affair. He would ask after her day and she would give a brief, polite answer. He would speak of small, inconsequential things, a new type of tea he had acquired, a skilled artisan he had met. The conversations were surface level, a careful dance around the vast, unspoken thing between them, their arranged marriage and the ghosts they both carried, though he knew only his own. He was always courteous, always respectful. But a distance remained, a wall of polite uncertainty. Lin Yu found herself watching him, studying the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way he would sometimes massage his temple after a long day. He was a man who carried great weight and he carried it alone. One evening he did not come home for dinner. A servant informed her that Master Jiang was still at the offices, dealing with a pressing matter. Lin Yu ate alone in the large dining hall, the clink of her utensils sounding unnaturally loud. A peculiar sense of concern, faint but persistent, pricked at her. This was the neglect Lin Xing had spoken of, she told herself. This was the reality. He was married to his work. But it felt different. It didn't feel like the cold abandonment of Shenwei. This felt like a storm brewing. Later, as she prepared for bed, she heard his return. Not the quiet, measured steps she was used to, but a heavier tread across the courtyard. She hesitated, then wrapped a robe around herself and moved to the screen door that led to the veranda. He was standing in the moonlight, not heading towards their chamber but staring out at the dark garden. His shoulders were slumped, the usual confident set gone. In the silver light he looked not like the formidable merchant but like a man defeated. The air around him vibrated with a quiet, potent frustration. He was so still, so utterly absorbed in his disappointment, that he didn't hear her approach. Lin Yu stopped a few paces away, her heart thudding strangely. This was a vulnerability she had not expected to see. Shen Wei's failures had always been met with cold fury, turned inward and outward. Jiang Feng's silence was different. It was the silence of a captain who had steered his ship into an unforeseen squall. She should turn back. It was not her place. Their unspoken agreement was one of separate lives, of polite coexistence. But the memory of his kindness, the book, the space, the lack of demand rose up in her. And another memory from her first life surfaced. Jiang Feng years from now, lamenting a significant loss on a shipment of Celadone porcelain that had been shattered in a sudden violent storm on the Great River. A storm that had happened this very season. The knowledge was a cold shock. It was happening now. The setback he was facing was the one she had indirectly heard about in another lifetime. An impulse, reckless and entirely unlike her, took hold. She could not tell him how she knew. But she could not stand there and do nothing. She retreated inside. On his desk, ledgers and papers were neatly stacked. A pot of tea, long gone cold, sat beside them. Her hands trembled as she picked up the top ledger. She opened it, her eyes scanning columns of figures she barely understood. But she didn't need to understand them. She needed to leave a breadcrumb. With a deep breath, she found a page related to river trade routes. Using the cold dregs of tea from the pot, she carefully, deliberately, let a single drop fall onto the name of the port he used for northern transfers. The water droplet smudged the ink slightly, a tiny blurred star next to the location. It was nothing. It was everything. Then she vanished back into the shadows of the bedroom, her pulse roaring in her ears. She heard him come in a few moments later. She lay in the dark, pretending sleep, listening to the rustle of his robes as he prepared for bed. She heard him pause at the desk. There was a long, tense silence. She could picture him staring at the ledger, at the accidental-looking smudge, his sharp mind already turning, questioning, reevaluating. The next morning he was gone before dawn. The day passed with an agonizing slowness. Lin Yu tried to read, to write, but her concentration was shattered. Had she overstepped? Had he seen through her pathetic ruse? Would he confront her, demand an explanation she could never give? He returned home early that evening. She heard his arrival from her library, the sound of his steps brisk and purposeful. He came straight to her, still wearing his traveling cloak. His face was not angry but alive with intense, bewildered curiosity. He stood in the doorway, his dark eyes pinning her where she sat. "The shipment," he said without preamble, his voice low and charged. "The one I told you about. It was lost." Lin Yu's blood ran cold. She had been wrong. She had misremembered. She had made a fool of herself and... "I received a message this morning. The entire cargo was destroyed in the storm on the Great River. A total loss." He took a step into the room, his gaze never leaving her face. "But it wasn't my cargo." She could only stare, her poem forgotten in her lap. "After I saw the ledger this morning," he continued, his words measured, "that smudge, it made me think. I sent a fast rider to the northern port on a hunch. I found a smaller, later shipment that needed transport. I diverted my cargo to it. Cost me a premium, but it traveled a different route. It arrived safely this afternoon." He moved closer until he was standing right before her. He didn't loom. He simply was there, a solid, real presence filled with a potent mix of relief and confusion. "My cargo is safe," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because of a spilled drop of tea on a ledger." Lin Yu's heart was hammering so violently she was sure he could see it. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his piercing gaze. It was luck," she whispered, the lye ash in her mouth. "A fortunate accident." "Was it?" The two words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken questions. He didn't press. He didn't accuse. He simply stood there waiting. And in his silence she felt something shift. The wall of polite uncertainty cracked. He was no longer looking at the quiet, obedient wife he had acquired. He was looking at a woman who possessed a mystery. A woman who had, for reasons he could not fathom, silently intervened and saved him from a significant loss. The respect in his eyes was no longer just courtesy. It was edged with a new, profound intensity. "Thank you," he said finally, the words simple and utterly sincere. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and left her there, sitting amidst her scrolls and books, her carefully constructed peace shattered. But it was not replaced by fear. It was replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of being truly seen for the first time. He didn't know what she was, but he knew she was more than she seemed. And instead of fear or anger, he had looked at her with gratitude. The unknown of her new life had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more real. Chapter 8. Shedding the Past. The fragile peace of the Jiang compound was shattered by the storm of Lin Yu's own mind. In the days that followed the averted trade disaster, a terrible tension took root within her. Jiang Feng's gratitude had been genuine, but his unspoken questions hung in the air between them like a fine mist, altering the quality of every glance, every polite inquiry. He watched her now. Not with suspicion but with a deep, unsettling curiosity. He would find reasons to be in the library while she was there, his presence a quiet, observant force. He began asking her opinion on small, inconsequential matters. The choice of a gift for a business associate, the aesthetic of a new tile for the courtyard fountain. It was as if he was testing the boundaries of her mind, searching for another glimpse of the uncanny insight she had displayed. Lin Yu felt herself fraying at the edges. The pressure of his regard, the weight of her secret, the constant low-level fear of exposure. It was a different kind of prison than Shen Wei's, but a prison nonetheless. She was playing a role again just as she had in her first life, but this role was infinitely more dangerous because it required her to hide a part of herself that had, for one reckless moment, dared to emerge. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. Shadows bloomed under her eyes. Her hands, which had begun to feel steady holding the warm gold of her bracelet, now trembled faintly. She jumped at sudden noises. The vibrant energy of the Jiang household, once a curious novelty, now felt abrasive and overwhelming. She was a ghost in a world of loud, living color, and she was terrified of being seen. The past became a palpable presence, a cold breath on the back of her neck. She found herself listening for the sound of a writing brush, her heart seizing at any sharp, scratching noise. The orderly silence of the Shen compound, once her torture, now perversely felt like a known quantity, a familiar misery she understood how to survive. This new life, with its confusing kindness and terrifying potential, was breaking her. The nightmare came on a night thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. She was back in the Shen compound. The air was frigid. From the study the sound began. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The relentless, metronomic scraping of the pen. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone. She tried to move, but her limbs were leaden. The scratching grew louder, filling her skull, drowning out her thoughts. She was trapped, invisible, dying alone in the perfect, beautiful silence, while the most important thing in her husband's world was the ink on a page. She woke with a strangled gasp, sitting bolt upright in the dark. The room was warm, the bed soft, but the cold from the dream clung to her. Sobs racked her body, silent, heaving things she tried to stifle in the silk pillows. The fear was absolute. It was not a memory. It was a reality she had lived, and in her exhausted, vulnerable state, it felt more real than the room around her. He was back there. She had never left. A soft sound came from beside her. A shift of weight. She had forgotten in her terror that she was not alone. Jiang Feng had begun tentatively to share the bedchamber after the incident with the ledger, though they still slept apart, a respectful space between them. Lin Yu. His voice was rough with sleep but alert. She froze, mortified. She had wanted to be invisible, and now she had revealed this humiliating weakness. A candle flared to life, casting a warm, dancing glow through the room. She kept her face buried in the pillows, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. She felt the dip of the mattress as he moved closer. He didn't touch her. "You were dreaming," he said, his voice low and calm. A bad dream. It was not a question. She could only nod, her body still trembling violently, the aftershocks of the nightmare coursing through her. There was a long pause. She could feel his gaze on her, could almost hear him thinking, weighing this new shattered piece of the puzzle that was his wife. Then a miracle. His hand came to rest on her back between her shoulder blades. The touch was firm, warm, and grounding. It was not a possessive touch, nor a romantic one. It was simply there. An anchor in the storm of her panic. The simple human contact undid her completely. The dam broke. A raw, broken confession was torn from her, muffled by the pillow. I was so alone before. The words hung in the candlelit air, stark and pathetic. She braced for questions, for disbelief, for confusion. Before what? What are you talking about? But Jiang Feng did not ask. He did not move his hand. His silence was not one of confusion but of absorption. He was taking her words, her pain, and simply holding space for them. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. You are not alone in this house. The words were simple. A statement of fact. Not a flowery promise, not a demand for explanation. Just a truth. You are here. I am here. Slowly, the violent trembling began to subside. The icy fear of the dream receded, chased away by the solid warmth of his hand, the reality of the candlelit room, the truth of his presence. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't try to fix it. He simply waited, a steady, silent presence, until her breathing evened out and the last of the tears were spent. Exhaustion, profound and absolute, washed over her. Her eyelids grew heavy. As she drifted back towards sleep, she was distantly aware of his hand gently smoothing her hair before he withdrew. She heard the soft sound of him blowing out the candle. The darkness returned, but it was different now. It was not the suffocating darkness of the Shen compound. It was a shared darkness, a protected space. He had seen her at her most broken, her most terrified. He had seen the ghost of a past he could not possibly understand. And he had not flinched. He had not demanded answers. He had offered a hand and a simple truth. Lin Yu fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time since her rebirth, the ghosts felt quiet. The past felt truly past. And the warm weight of the gold bracelet on her wrist felt less like a chain from a gilded cage, and more like a tether to a new, solid earth. Chapter 9. Building a New Language. The morning after the nightmare dawned bright and clear. Lin Yu awoke feeling strangely light, as if a fever had broken. The memory of her breakdown was there, a humiliating blush on her cheeks, but it was overshadowed by the memory of Jiang Feng's hand on her back, his voice in the dark. You are not alone. He was already gone when she rose, but the space he occupied in the house felt different. The wary curiosity was gone, replaced by a new, quiet consideration. A subtle shift had occurred in the night, a door unlocked between them. That afternoon he found her in the library. She was attempting to copy the elegant foreign script from her book of poetry, her brow furrowed in concentration. The characters flow from right to left. His voice came from the doorway, not startling her but simply announcing his presence. She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe, watching her, a faint smile on his lips. He looked more at ease than she had ever seen him. I cannot make sense of them, she admitted, setting down her brush. But the shapes are beautiful. He entered the room and came to stand beside her, looking down at her clumsy attempts. He smelled of sunshine and open air. The beauty is in the meaning. This one, he pointed to a character that looked like a bird in flight, speaks of a longing for home that is carried on the wind. He knew the language. Of course he did. The realization sent a little thrill through her. You have been to these western regions? She asked, her voice filled with genuine awe. To their borders, he said, pulling up a stool to sit beside her. The deserts are vast. Silence there has a different weight. It feels ancient. He spoke not like a merchant describing trade routes, but like a traveler sharing a secret. He told her of stars that looked different in the black desert sky, of music that sounded like both joy and sorrow. Lin Yu listened, captivated. This was his world. Not the world of ledgers and profits but the world of experiences, of landscapes and people. She, in turn, found herself speaking of the poetry she loved, not just reciting it, but explaining why a certain turn of phrase could capture the exact feeling of a rain-soaked evening or the melancholy of a fading bloom. They were building a language. Not of words but of shared understanding. His practicality began to temper her ethereal concepts, and her artistry began to soften his sharp edges. A few days later he came to her with a practical problem, but he presented it like a shared puzzle. "I am naming a new trade route," he said, unrolling a map on her desk. It showed a treacherous path through mountain passes. "It needs a name that is auspicious, but also memorable to the men who will travel it. Something that speaks of safe passage and good fortune." This was her world. The world of meaning and metaphor. Lin Yu studied the map, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of the mountains. She thought of the poems about journeys, about guidance and protection. "What about the star-following path?" she suggested softly. "The stars have guided travelers since ancient times. It implies a constant celestial guide through the darkness and uncertainty." Jiang Feng was silent for a moment, looking from the map to her face. A slow, genuine smile spread across his features, one that reached his eyes and lit them from within. "It's perfect," he said, his voice full of undisguised admiration. "It is exactly right." He did not just take the name and leave. He stayed and they began to talk of other things. He asked her opinion on the redesign of a courtyard garden that had always felt unbalanced to him. She suggested a weeping willow near the pond, not just for shade, but to create a sense of graceful melancholy that would complement the sturdy bamboos. He listened. He truly listened. And then he gave the orders for it to be done. Lin Yu began to leave her mark on the Jiang compound in subtle, beautiful ways. She arranged flowers not just for color but for feeling. She chose the motifs for new cushions and screens, weaving poetry and art into the very fabric of the home. The house began to feel less like a display of wealth and more like a lived-in, loved-in space. It began to feel like her home. She was no longer a guest or a ghost or a beautiful object. She was becoming the mistress of the house in truth. The servants, who had initially been polite but distant, now came to her with questions and requests, sensing her growing confidence and her husband's clear respect. The change was most evident in Jiang Feng himself. The tired lines around his eyes seemed to soften. He began to come home earlier, not with the weight of the world on his shoulders, but with a lightness in his step. He sought her out not out of curiosity or duty, but for the simple pleasure of her company. They would walk in the gardens at dusk, talking of everything and nothing. The silence between them was no longer awkward but comfortable. He was sharing his world with her, and in return she was helping him create a new one. A home. She was no longer afraid of the vibrant energy of his life. She was learning to move with it, to add her own quiet melody to its symphony. The gold bracelet on her wrist no longer felt like a foreign weight. It felt like a part of her. It was solid and real, just like the life she was building. She had traded the cold, silent poetry of her first life for a living, breathing poem that she was writing every day, in partnership with the man who had given her a book and a space to grow. The fear was gone. In its place was a steady, thrumming sense of rightness. She had not just found a refuge from her past, she had found a future. And it was more beautiful than any verse she had ever read. Chapter 10. A Warm Harbor. The change had been so gradual, so woven into the fabric of her days, that Lin Yu hadn't noticed the precise moment the fear had left her. It had simply faded like winter frost yielding to the persistent sun, replaced by a profound and steady sense of belonging. The Jiang compound was no longer a labyrinth of unknown noises and unfamiliar faces. It was a symphony whose rhythms she knew by heart. The distant clatter from the kitchens in the mid-morning, the rhythmic sweep of the gardener's brooms in the afternoon, the particular cadence of Jiang Feng's footsteps returning home in the evening, now earlier and more frequent than before. She stood in her library, the room that had once been her sanctuary and was now her command center. Account books for the household lay open on one side of the desk, and on the other her own poetry, the characters flowing more freely than they ever had in her first life. She was reviewing the menus for the week with the head cook, suggesting a dish of braised pork belly that Jiang Feng particularly favored, when a servant appeared at the door. "Madam, a messenger from the Lin family." A ripple of anxiety, old and faint, passed through her. News from home could still bring a flicker of the old dread. She took the sealed letter, dismissing the cook with a nod. Breaking the familiar seal, she read her mother's flowing script. The letter was full of news, but one piece dominated. Scholar Shin Wei had achieved a significant promotion at the Hanlin Academy. Madame Wang's words were tinged with a familiar, covetous pride, but also a new, hesitant curiosity. Such illustrious news from the Shin family. One wonders what great things he will accomplish next. I trust all is well and prosperous in your own household. The words should have been a barb. They should have summoned the ghost of that cold, silent life, should have sparked a bitter ember of regret or jealousy. But as Lin Yu read them, she felt nothing. No pang of loss, no twist of envy. Shin Wei's success was a story about a stranger, a tale from a book she had closed long ago. She felt a presence in the doorway and looked up. Jiang Feng stood there, home even earlier than usual. He had seen the messenger. "News from your family?" he asked, his voice neutral but his eyes watchful. He knew the history, knew the shadow the Shin name could cast. "Yes," Lin Yu said, and to her own surprise a soft smile touched her lips. She held out the letter. "Shin Wei has been promoted. Mother is impressed." Jiang Feng took the letter, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. He handed it back to her, his gaze searching her face. "And you?" The question was simple, but it held the weight of their entire journey. He was asking if the ghost still had power here. Lin Yu looked around the sunlit room at the account books that represented her responsibility, the poetry that represented her freedom, at the man before her who saw her, truly saw her. She thought of the nightmare that no longer came, of the warm weight of the gold bracelet on her wrist that felt like a part of her own skin. She met his gaze, her smile deepening, reaching her eyes until they crinkled at the corners. "I feel nothing but happiness for my sister's good fortune," she said, and it was the complete and utter truth. "And gratitude for my own." The tension in Jiang Feng's shoulders eased. A look of deep, unguarded contentment settled on his features. He didn't need to say anything more. The answer was in her face, in the peaceful ease of her posture. That evening they took their meal in the smaller, more intimate courtyard garden, the one she had redesigned. The weeping willow she had suggested brushed its leaves gently against the surface of the pond, and the first stars of the evening began to prick through the twilight sky. The conversation was easy, flowing from the mundane details of their day to a discussion of a new volume of poetry he had tracked down for her. Later they retired to the library. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light. Jiang Feng sat with a ledger open on his lap, but he wasn't truly reading. Lin Yu was attempting to decipher another poem from her foreign book, her brow furrowed in concentration. A comfortable silence settled over them, thick and warm as a blanket. It was a silence Lin Yu had once feared, but this silence was alive. It was filled with the shared understanding of two people who had built a world together, brick by careful brick. She reached for her teacup at the same moment he reached for his. Their hands brushed, not a fleeting accident but a deliberate, lingering touch. His fingers were warm, the calluses on his skin a familiar topography. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand, letting her palm slide against his, a silent answer to a question that had been asked over months of shared looks, quiet conversations and steadfast kindness. He set his ledger aside. She looked up from her book. His dark eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not curiosity, not gratitude, but a deep, abiding affection that had grown as steadily and surely as the willow tree outside. He didn't need to speak. Neither did she. He leaned forward and gently took the book from her hands, setting it aside. He drew her to her feet, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to retreat. She did not. She went willingly into his arms. This was not the cold, dutiful coupling of her first life. This was a coming home. It was the final gentle merging of two separate worlds into one shared warm space. It was a silent vow, spoken in touches and shared breath, that the past was truly gone, and the future was theirs to hold together. Later, as she lay nestled in the circle of his arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, Lin Yu knew. The quiet, overlooked eldest daughter was gone. The ghost in the cold compound was gone. In her place was Lin Yu, wife of Jiang Feng, mistress of a warm and vibrant home. A woman whose poetry was no longer locked away in her heart, but was lived in every sunlit courtyard, every shared glance, every moment of this hard-won, deeply cherished peace. She had not just found a safe harbor. She had helped build it. And as she drifted into a deep and dreamless sleep, she knew with absolute certainty that she was home. Bonus chapter: The Language of Light. 5 years had woven themselves into the tapestry of the Jiang household like threads of gold. The compound, once a place of bustling anonymity, now hummed with a deep, contented energy that was a direct reflection of its mistress. Lin Yu stood on the veranda of her private library, watching the afternoon sun gild the leaves of her willow tree. Its branches, now fuller, trailed gracefully in the koi pond, just as she had envisioned. In her arms, a small weight shifted and made a soft, sleepy sound. Her daughter, Xiaoyu, named for the moon but with her father's bright, observant eyes, was fighting a losing battle against a nap. A pair of strong, familiar arms encircled her from behind, and a chin came to rest gently on her shoulder. Jiang Feng breathed in deeply, the scent of her hair and their child mingling with the fragrance of lotus blossoms from the pond. "The ship from the south is docked," he said, his voice a low rumble against her back. "The one carrying the new silks. There is a bolt the color of the sky just after a storm. I thought it would suit you." Lin Yu leaned back into his embrace, a smile touching her lips. "You don't have to bring me gifts every time a ship comes in," she murmured, though the pleasure was evident in her voice. "It is not a gift," he corrected softly, his breath warm against her ear. "It is a translation." He understood. The silks, the spices, the rare books, they were his way of sharing the world he traversed. He brought her the colors, the textures, the stories of distant lands, and she wove them into the soul of their home. It was their language. Xiaoyu finally succumbed to sleep, her little body going limp. Carefully, Lin Yu turned within the circle of her husband's arms and passed their daughter to him. He cradled the child with a natural, effortless ease that still made Lin Yu's heart constrict with a love so fierce it was almost painful. This, a man who commanded merchant fleets gently rocking his daughter to sleep, was a sight her first life self could never have even dreamed of. He pressed a kiss to Xiaoyu's forehead before carrying her inside to her waiting nursemaid. When he returned, he found Lin Yu not on the veranda but at her desk. She was not writing poetry but reviewing the household accounts with a focused air. The once daunting columns of numbers now made a familiar, logical sense to her. She looked up as he entered, her brush pausing. "The expenses for the Mid-Autumn Festival are higher than last year," she noted, not with worry but with practical interest. "Shall we increase the order of mooncakes for the staff, or would it be better to commission a troupe of musicians for the evening?" Jiang Feng sat across from her, stretching his long legs out. He watched her, this wife of his who could discuss profit margins with the same thoughtful care she used to discuss poetic meter. "The musicians," he decided after a moment. "The accounts can bear it. And the sound of music is a different kind of wealth for a home." Their eyes met, and a world of understanding passed between them in that glance. He saw the graceful, intelligent woman who had built a life with him. She saw the man who valued that intelligence, who had given her not just a home but a partnership. Later that evening, after the household had quieted, they walked together in the moonlit garden. The air was cool and carried the scent of night-blooming flowers. Their hands were linked, swinging gently between them. "I met with Scholar Shen today," Jiang Feng said casually. Lin Yu's step didn't falter. The name was just a name now. "Oh." He was at the tea house, holding court with a group of junior academics. He spoke of the burdens of his position and the lack of tranquility in his home. Jiang Feng's tone was neutral, merely reporting. "His wife, it seems, has many social engagements." Lin Yu thought. Her sister was building her own happiness in her own way, filling the scholar's quiet world with the vivacious energy she had once been punished for. The thought made her smile. "I think," Jiang Feng continued, a note of deep satisfaction in his voice, "that he was attempting to make me feel inferior. A merchant, for all his wealth, cannot understand the weight of intellectual pursuits." "And what did you say?" Lin Yu asked, amused. "I said that the quietest libraries often hold the loudest regrets," Jiang Feng replied, "and that I preferred a home filled with the sound of my wife's laughter and my daughter's questions." It seemed a far richer text to study. Lin Yu stopped walking and turned to face him. In the silver moonlight, his features were sharp and handsome, his eyes pools of dark warmth. She reached up and cupped his cheek, her thumb gently stroking his skin. "You are a poet, Jiang Feng," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You just don't use words." He covered her hand with his own, turning his head to press a kiss into her palm. "I have you to translate for me," he said. And in that moonlit garden, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, Linyu knew that every moment of regret from her first life had been worth it. It had all led her here to this man, to this love that was built not on grand declarations, but on 1,000 small silent understandings. A language of light and touch and coming home.